Alright, hey everyone, I'm going to dive straight into this, modernism in Hemingway's The Sun Also Rises. So, one of the main features of modernism is that it does away with the plot-centric novel, and this is something that Hemingway obviously does in The Sun Also Rises. The plot revolves more around the characters' relationships with each other, in particular Cohen with all of his various partners, and the relationship between Jake and Brett seems to be one of the major recurring themes throughout The Sun Also Rises. A sense of being lost in a dizzying landscape is something that the book certainly has, especially with the beginning of the fiesta and all of the chaos that ensues as a result of that. And in particular, I'm thinking of like the musicians, the rockets, the dancers going down the street. All of that seems to just be a blur, and all of these foreign elements just kind of cause the narrator to view his surroundings in this fragmented fashion. It's really dizzying, and it's really, like I said, the whole thing is just a blur. That whole segment just goes by so quickly, especially in contrast to the rest of the novel, which I won't say it's slower paced, but I will say much of it revolves around individual conversations, and once the fiesta hits, it's very much disorienting, both to the narrator and to the reader. I think the subjectivity of the narrator is also something that factors in pretty heavily into The Sun Also Rises, because obviously anything from the first person point of view is going to have some form of bias with it. You're going to have something that's going to change because of that person's perspective. I'm just thinking about what the novel would have been like if, say, Robert Cohen had narrated, or maybe even Brett's point of view had been presented, because so much of that book depends on the relationships between the characters themselves. It would be hard to have an objective point of view from a first person narrator in that plot. I mean, third person would have been the only way that Hemingway could have narrated this objectively, but I mean, that's obviously not the point. This was modernism, so having a subjective narrator, I think, was something that factored pretty heavily into this. And Jake's wounds during the war also impact his perspective, as they directly affect his interactions with Brett and his inability to carry on a relationship with her, and the hindrance that these wounds provide. And they also seem to bring up the challenge of figuring out oneself and the challenge of identity, who Jake is without his sexual identity. And the contrast is interesting between Jake and Robert Cohen, because Cohen carries out multiple affairs during the course of the novel, and he seems to be defined by most of these interactions. I'm paraphrasing here, but when Jake witnesses the argument between Cohen and Francis early on in the novel, he says something along the lines of, "I didn't know anyone could hate Robert Cohen like this." And it seems like Jake's first impression and the reader's first negative impression of Robert Cohen stems through this interaction with women and his sexual identity. So this in many ways fleshes the character of Robert Cohen out. And we obviously learn a lot about his character through this sexual identity. And that's something that Jake is missing. That's a big piece of the puzzle of Jake's character that simply isn't there. I think in a lot of ways, The Sun Also Rises is about who Jake is in the absence of sex and his journey to discover this identity. And another piece is who Jake is after the war. Jake's wounds are a direct result of what happened in the war, and in a sense, this wound is no different than PTSD. It impacts his relationships with others, it colors his perspective. So, the war and the aftermath of the war is another big piece of this novel. It would obviously be a very different story if Jake could have a sexual identity, but in a lot of ways, this novel is about being lost as a person because of who Jake is or is not, and the way Jake deals with these wounds. I'm not sure that many of the other characters actually look at him differently as a result of his wounds, except for maybe Brett, but he certainly seems to view himself differently. And this ties back into the fragmented, splintered narrative of the novel, because Jake's telling of the novel, even though it doesn't initially seem so, is a very emotional, a very biased perspective, and a very swayed lens through which the reader views the story. And this form of narration is essentially what makes The Sun Also Rises modernist. Without Jake's perspective and narration, I'm not sure that the fiesta would have had the same impact that it had, in the sense of being disorienting or being dizzying or feeling lost as a reader in that setting. So, in a nutshell, the narrator seems to be the pivotal point of both modernism and The Sun Also Rises. That's a main key point. That's a main piece of the puzzle because that's how we view the war. That's how we feel the landscape. That's how it is made new in many ways, for Hemingway at least, because without Jake, the same story could have been told in a way that is not modernist. Alright, I'm going to wrap it up here, guys, but thanks for listening.